All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. And welcome back to everyone that joined in on our February 2nd session. There we went over the Power 2021 RFP and application process. If you missed that and are interested in seeing what we covered, we uploaded a recording of it and added a link to our website, arc.gov/power. And that link is arc.gov/power is where you can find all power related resources. It's a good one-stop shop. Today's session will be a compilation of some of the frequently asked questions we have received from you all over this past month or so. They are loosely arranged in topic areas and we'll have different ARC staff members helping answer them for us. The questions are more generalized so that they are more broadly applicable across various project types. But if you do have a specific question or even a follow-up, please leave it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We have staff monitoring it and they'll be answering everything that they can. If we can't get to you, we are saving a log of the questions and we'll follow up with you directly afterwards to make sure your question gets answered. But before we jump into these questions, I just want to very briefly go through some of the high-level things we covered a few weeks ago as a quick refresh and for those who may be joining in for the first time today. So first off, what is POWER? POWER stands for Partnerships for Opportunity and Workforce and Economic Revitalization. It makes federal resources available to communities and regions impacted by the decline of the coal economy. And that's not just coal mining, but it's called coal power plant operations, coal-related supply chain and logistics industries. Broadly, there are two different types of POWER awards. The first is implementation, and these can have ARC requests of 400,000 to 1.5 million. They last up to 3 years, and they're for the delivery of programming within a defined scope of work that you put in your application. There's a couple different implementation project types that have some different kind of criteria involved, such as access to capital and broadband deployment. We have those criteria in the appendices as well. So please, if you're interested in those, check out those appendices. And the other award type are the planning awards. They're a bit smaller, up to $50,000 in size. They last up to 12 months, and they involve the development of plans and feasibility studies that will hopefully lead to the development of a full implementation proposal down the line, either via POWER or some other funding source. And here are the 5 POWER investment priorities. I won't go into them in detail here, but do know that staff recorded 5 videos, one for each of these, that kind of go into the nuances of each project type, kind of in detail. They last about 10 to 15 minutes, and they can also be found on our website, arc.gov/power. But real quickly, there are workforce development, entrepreneurship, industry clusters, SUD response, and broadband. But first off, this is a question we've gotten a fair amount, and it's just more generally, what's the biggest difference between this year's POWER RFP and previous years? I would say the main one is the structure and the inclusion of the review rubric in the actual RFP. So you can see the review rubric here. We want as much transparency as possible so you know what we are looking for in your POWER proposal. But the overall investment goals and priorities remain the same to years past, as well as the grant types and eligibility requirements. So be sure to know your project type and what review criteria you will be evaluated under. So first up, the first person I want to bring up is Bettina Jones. She's a program manager in our division of critical infrastructure. And Bettina, you here?
Yep, right here.
Awesome. So some interested applicants don't yet know exactly what course of action they want to take or which partners to involve, even though they generally know what the problem is that needs to be addressed in their community. What should they do?
It might be a good idea to explore doing a planning project, which lasts 1 year before applying for implementation funds. You could do this to contract out a plan for implementation, a feasibility study, cost-benefit analysis, or whatever else you might need to produce to be project ready. It's ideal for grantees who aren't sure of the exact activities to do or what course of action to take. So you should be thinking, what do I need to do or accomplish or learn or know for me to be ready to make an implementation project at ARC or elsewhere.
Yeah, thanks, Bettina. Yeah, those studies or plans are really helpful when potentially applying for a full implementation effort down the line, like we said, via Power or another funding source. And the whole planning TA project process is a real organizing effort that can really lay the groundwork and help organizations better understand the resources at their disposal. Okay, so you and your team have decided what kind of project you want to submit. The next step in the application process is to send in a letter of intent. And we've received a few questions, especially those somewhat new to Power, about what the application is really like. For this, I'm going to call it Karen Fabiano. She's ARC's LDD program manager, and as well as manager at large of the Power program.
All right. Good morning.
Morning.
Yes, so it's important to remember, and that deadline is certainly just right around the corner, that when you submit that letter of intent, there's a few things that happen. First, you need to make sure that you use the proper template, which is on the Power page, and that you submit it in a PDF format by the deadline to power@arc.gov. And then ARC staff will take that letter of intent and look for any red flags in terms of eligibility. But keep in mind that we will not be providing any comments on the subject matter content because this is a competitive program. And then once staff has that letter of intent, expect a few days before we can get back to you because the volume will increase as we get closer to that deadline. And so once we look at that letter of intent, then we will get back to you in an email with all the instructions that you need to know in terms of how you can access the portal and then begin to work on your application. Keep in mind one thing as you complete and submit your letter of intent, that as you work on your application and you suddenly determine that you need to make substantial changes, we will not be able to consider that application in terms of the review. So please be as specific as you can in your letter of intent. But if you've already submitted it by the deadline and then you decide that you may need to make substantial changes, that will present a problem and will lead to disqualification.
Okay, thanks, Karen. So once eligibility is kind of confirmed by ARC, and we'll touch more on that a little bit later, you'll get an email from us with instruction on how to access the portal. Is the person listed on the letter of intent the only person that can work on or submit an application for an organization?
No, while we will be sending in that instruction guidance to the one person that's a contact person, at that point, when that key contact person goes into the portal, they have the opportunity to add contacts and folks that can work on the application. And the important thing to remember, if you're that key contact, that you also need to include your authorized representative, because the authorized representative is the one person that will have the authority to hit the submit button on the April 16th deadline.
Okay, awesome. So make sure you keep your contacts organized and everyone, especially the authorized rep, is familiar with the application portal before they submit.
That's right. Yep.
So you touched on this a little bit earlier, mentioning the states. What role do the states play in the Power application process?
Yeah, the states play actually two very important roles. They work with both the outreach and in the review process. So as we may have mentioned before, the letter of intent, a copy of that will be sent to the states that will be impacted with the project. So that will be their first indication that a project may be in their area, but that will not count as the official outreach to the state program managers. So it's your responsibility that you need to reach out to the state program manager or managers if it's in more than one state, and just check in with them so that they're familiar with your project, because it's their job to check to make sure that the proposal's in alignment with their particular state economic development priorities. And then at that point, and if there's more than one state, please make sure you reach out to all the state program managers. So if you're really ambitious and have a project that is in all 13 states, you will need to reach out to all 13 states. So just kind of keep that in mind. And then the next part of the state responsibility and rollout is they also serve on our review team. So when the full application is submitted April 16th, we then share those applications with our state partners, and they'll take a look at it initially to make sure that the proposal is in alignment with their particular state economic development plans and strategies, and will determine if it's okay to move forward. So you want to make sure that you've had that contact in conversation with the state program managers. And so that's why it's, please make sure that you do that.
Awesome. Yeah. So I would say it's always better to reach out sooner rather than later to those state program managers, especially with that April 16th deadline come in, because deadlines for action and also cause chaos sometimes.
That's right. Exactly.
Shifting gears a little bit, Karen, a lot of interested applicants are reaching out at this time to confirm eligibility. We have listed in the RFP what types of organizations are eligible, but things do get, for lack of a better word, murky when you get to those clauses about being a previous power grantee and their eligibility for this round. So if you are a partner or subawardee on a current power grant or project, can they serve as a lead applicant or grantee on an application this round?
Yes, the simple answer is yes, but then as you say, it gets a little bit murkier. So if you're a subawardee or partner, you are certainly eligible for this round, but please make sure that if you're involved with other power proposals as that partner and you're coming in for an application, please make sure that you put in your application that you document your administrative capacity, because the first question that comes to mind to a reviewer is, well, you're a partner in this one, you're proposing to come in for a new one. Will you and your staff and your team be able to manage the program? So that will be important to document that. And one other note that is also mentioned in the RFP. So if you haven't already looked at the RFP, please make sure that you do. We have another note that if you are currently working on an open power grant, but you're planning to close it out by October 1st of this year, then you would be eligible to also submit for power. So just keep that in mind. But if you're in the beginning stages of a power, then you would not be able to submit as a direct applicant. Now, there is an exception. We have local development districts that we work with, and they serve their regions and multiple jurisdictions and partners in their region. So we do allow local development districts to be able to apply for multiple power applications. So just keep that in mind as you're working with your power. That might be a good partner. Or if you're ineligible, it might be a project that you talk to them about and see if they have some ideas.
Okay, awesome. So you can only have one power project at a time as a lead applicant or grantee, unless you're an LDD. Right. And also similar, you can only submit one per round.
Correct.
We would throw out not the most recently submitted one.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So with eligibility, we get this a fair amount as well from some applicants. Are different departments or schools of a university or large organizations considered separate entities when it comes to power applications?
Quick answer is no. So how we look at it is that in this scenario that Braden has just presented, ARC considers this as one entity. So only one application can be submitted by the university. So if you're a university and you have multiple power ideas or proposals, you're going to have to decide which one you want to submit. The only other option is that maybe you look at one of your other partners that might be, that could be considered as the official applicant. But if you're a university, and most universities have multiple divisions, you really have to select which power proposal you're going to come in with.
Okay, awesome. And also, you could also reach out to your local development district.
Correct.
They're kind of not burdened by that restriction.
That's
awesome.
Correct.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you.
So this eligibility talk can seem a bit almost like legalese at points, but for a deeper dive into the more legal components of applying, receiving, and managing a power award, I want to bring up ARC Deputy General Counsel Nancy Isle.
Thank you, Braden. Hi, everybody.
So quickly, so Nancy, top line, what is the #1 piece of legal advice you would provide to a power applicant?
The #1 piece of legal advice that I would offer to a power applicant is to start with the end in sight. That means that knowing at the outset that all of the funds and match associated with the project may be subject to audit and must be supported by documentation. It's good to keep that in mind now. This is the time to start thinking about what's required. Look at the internal controls of your organization. Look at the financial management procedures. Look and see whether you have an IT backups, system to back up your IT and all your records. Look into the legal requirements now. Start reading Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 200, which can be found at www.ecfr.gov or on our website. Start looking at Chapter 8 of our code, of the ARC code, also on our website, that lists requirements for grants. The requirement to file a lien if you're going to be buying property, real property, or improving real property, or making large equipment purchases. So start looking at conflicts of interest requirements, procurement, record retention, the difference between subaward and contract, etc.
Okay, so best to get your kind of ducks in a row right now to ensure a smoother ride later. And if you think of an issue that's coming up, address it quickly with staff as well. Just make sure it gets handled sooner rather than later. You touch on something at the end there that has been a central point that you bring up a lot in the trainings that I've seen you give, which is the whole sub-awardee subcontractor issue, because they mean different things. So what exactly is the difference between a sub-awardee and a subcontractor?
That's a really good question, Braden. And it's actually one of the first things that I cover in the training once an award is made. If you're not planning on doing all the work yourself, then you're going to need either a contractor or you're going to have to award a sub grant. And the reason this is so important is that the legal obligations, the legal relationship is determined by that decision. So what is the difference? A contractor is typically, and by the way, it's not always clear, the regulations at 2 CFR 200.331 go into the factors that might need to be considered, because there's not always just one. You might have to look at 5 factors. But typically, if work can be done from 9 to 5, can be done competitively, and the contractor would do it for anybody out there, if that person pays the right amount, that's probably going to be a contractor. Also, if it's something that is done for your organization, like trash removal or something like that. But if it's an entity that has a role at the table and working for the purpose, the purpose of the grant, the public purpose, the public good, that is probably going to be a sub-grant. So it's really important to make this decision, and it's not always easy. We have a legal newsletter we could share at some point. Another thing to keep in mind is that all the regulations that apply to grantees flow down to all of the sub-grantees. So if you have a partner and your partner is a grantee and you're a sub-grantee, all the regulations that we discuss here, the OMB regulations and all ARC requirements will apply. Whereas with contracts, not everything flows down, but they do have to be competitively awarded. So that's another key distinction.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so it's clear. So make sure you have a clear understanding between all your partners and project partners and sub-awardees about who is responsible for what. So this kind of got touched on earlier with Karen. So you have a great big idea, but you don't think you have sufficient capacity to manage both the administrative and implementation aspects of a power award. So you have the option of utilizing a fiscal sponsor. And Karen kind of mentioned this about if you're not eligible, having a partner serve as a lead applicant. What should applicants know if they're considering using a fiscal sponsor?
Yeah, another really good question, Braden. So yes, absolutely. The fiscal sponsor in that context would be, or this scenario would be called a pass-through entity under OMB regulations. That fiscal sponsor would be responsible for, has a lot of actually responsibilities. It kind of is standing in our place over the design grantee, which would be the sub-grantee under the regulations. They would have to make sure there's a written agreement and include certain information, evaluate the compliance for, risk for non-compliance, monitor activities, make sure the sub-grantee or grantee gets a single audit and respond on behalf of the sub-grantee or grantee on that audit. So it's, if an organization discovers that they just don't have the capacity, or let's say that you have several different partners working on a project, you might want to make sure that the entity with the most capacity is the grantee, because there will be more responsibilities on that grantee as a fiscal agent or pass-through entity more responsibilities over the other partners. So, it is a great way to, still get a power grant and make sure that you can say, well, we have our bases covered. We might not have the capacity to do everything, all the administrative stuff, but we are going to get a fiscal agent to do that. And this fiscal agent has the capacity to monitor our activities.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much, Nancy. So essentially the lead applicant is overall responsible for the management of the award. So there's a lot here, and I know we could do an hours-long training on the legal components of these grants, but I think the important reference point here is that CFR 200, the Code of Federal Regulations. I know it's probably somewhat tedious reading for non-lawyers, but a lot of the questions you answered here can be cited there. Yeah, awesome.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Nancy. And so we're going to move from the legal questions to some on budget and match. And here I'm going to phone in Emila Halilovic, ARC's Director of Business and Workforce Investments. Emila?
Hi, good morning.
Good morning, Emila. So a question I get fairly often, and this kind of applies to workforce training programs, revolves around allowable expenses. So can an applicant use ARC funds to reimburse program participants for their tuition or program costs?
Thanks, Brandon. That's a really good question. And as you said, this is a very common question we get for applications which have a workforce development component. So the answer to that question is yes. The cost of training and education provided for students is an allowable and reimbursable expense. I recommend, if you're interested in learning more about allowable expenses, I recommend that you look up the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR 200, Part E, Cost Principles. Here you will find a list of allowable expenses for various program activities.
Okay, so there's that CFR 200 again. So next question regarding match, which is about match, which is required of all projects. And in the February 2nd session, we mentioned that there's a formula to calculate match based on your project's geography. So once you've figured out how much match you need for your project and you started organizing it, how does one, like an applicant, demonstrate the status of those matching funds? And does the status of that match influence the application's review?
Good question again. So yes, the status of your match does affect the scoring of your application. Any applicant must identify resources that will be leveraged as match and the status of that match. So for example, if the match is confirmed or pending, and any resources you're thinking about bringing or weaving into the project, you should be listing those resources as match, and that should be confirmed or accessible within 60 days of the contract date. Applicants also, in addition to that, should demonstrate community and regional commitment to the proposed project by combining ARC resources with a diverse array of match types. For example, if the match type is in cash, in kind, or loans, and other sources of match as well, such as public, private, philanthropic. And again, I recommend, and you also showed us a really good picture of the scoring rubric. So for any more details on match funds and scoring, please take a look at the RFP and specifically the scoring rubric.
Awesome. Yeah, and there is space on the application portal when you're filling it out to provide some more details about your match, especially if it is a pending perspective. This will help reviewers better understand what is going on and provide a little more context for them as they review. But awesome. Thanks, Emila.
No problem. My pleasure.
So moving on to another section of the application that carries some weight is coal impact. And I'm going to bring up Logan Thomas again. He's ARC's resident economist in our research and evaluation departments. Logan, you did a great job covering all aspects of coal impact on our February 2nd session. Today, I want to pick at some nuance that's in the application in the review rubric. So what I'm looking for is, what is the difference between the coal impact narrative and the section for how the proposal addresses direct impacts of coal impact job losses? Those would be kind of similar, but there's a nuance there.
Sure, that's a great question, Braden. Probably your best one yet today, in my opinion. But first, I'm going to actually step back. In the coal impact section on the application includes actually two components. So you have the data table and then you have the narrative. The first of these two is automatically generated based on the project's geographic area. And so reviewers see county level data for a variety of measures related to the coal industry. You have direct mining employment losses, but then also 3 measures related to the broader coal supply chain. Dependence, impact, and risk. I won't get into the details with those again. But again, the good news here is that this table is automatically generated based on the project's geographic area. So there's nothing applicants have to do. But then in the narrative section is where applicants are able to provide some additional information. So you have other data points, anecdotes, news coverage, stuff that gives reviewers a more contextualized view of the geographic area impacted by the power proposal. An important thing to remember here is that reviewers aren't necessarily as intimately familiar with your community. So it's your job as the applicants to provide the more nuanced, more personalized story of how the coal industries impacted your community. So here's where you not only bring in additional data points, but then also you talk about the businesses that have closed or the power plants that have shut down. And then also how those impacts have been felt throughout the community. So talk about declining school enrollments or the loss of other industries, population decline, unemployment rates, labor force participation. You can talk about shorter term kind of sudden shocks or even longer term, more gradual declines. So that's the coal impact section. But then there's another section in the application asking about how your proposal will provide a direct impact on the coal-related job losses. This latter section doesn't ask so much about what's going on in the community as it does how the proposal will address the specific issues facing the community. For example, if there have been significant job losses in your community, you might talk about how an entrepreneurial hub might lead to business development and then later job creation. It doesn't have to be that direct, but the closer you can tie your proposal to addressing any coal-related job losses, the better. So I think the quick takeaway is that the coal narrative section is what's happening in your community, and then the specific question later on is how your proposal will address what is happening. So I think that should do it, Braden.
Awesome, yeah. And that's kind of the same takeaway I took there. So the coal impact narrative, kind of the personalized story about the impact on the community. And then the tie-in is more how those issues have kind of directly informed the design of your proposal.
Exactly.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Logan.
Thanks, Braden.
So next up is kind of some questions on performance measurement. So all applicants are required when they fill out the application to list some of the goals that they propose to hit throughout their project. And for that, I'm going to bring up Jeff Schwartz. He's a program manager in our Business and Workforce Investments Division, specializing in kind of educational workforce programs.
Thank you, Braden.
So when they're going through the application, they will select their project classification, and it'll kind of give them a list of performance measurements. One question we get often is, what is meant by served and improved, such as students served and students improved?
Yes, that is a frequent question. We measure students served and improved, workers, trainees served and improved, as well as participants and businesses. In a workforce program, served means that the individual has been touched by the project, they've enrolled in the program, and they're starting to receive services. Improved means that they've obtained a new job or perhaps enhanced their current position. Maybe they got a promotion or a raise. If you're working with lots of different partners and some are providing wraparound services such as counseling, others are providing training, maybe a business partner is providing an entrepreneurship. The key is we're looking at the project level. So we only want to count an individual served once when they start the program, wherever they start in your program, and then we'll count them as improved when they obtain that job or get a promotion at their job.
Okay, awesome. So you kind of figured out what each of the different performance measurements means. So another question we get is, what happens if you don't meet your performance goals that you have listed on your application and in your project agreements? Is it better to be conservative and use lower numbers there?
Well, the good news is there's no financial penalty. So ARC does not have what they sometimes call a clawback feature to our grants. If you don't meet your goals that you set out, you don't have to reimburse ARC, but be aware that some of your other funders may have such a feature. And we are aware, especially after this past year, that many things occur that are going to be beyond your control. Lots of things are going to happen. Situation is going to change. And the key is keep your ARC project coordinator informed and seek their guidance on how to work through that. If you don't meet your goals in your final report, be sure to explain what happened, how it impacted your project, and keep documentation of all those events with your project files. You may be asked about them if you're audited. To begin with, your goals should be realistically optimistic. If they're too low, it could impact how your project is reviewed. So be realistic and explain the basis for your projections. Also, you don't want to exaggerate them or be too high, because if they appear to be unrealistic, that could also impact how your project is reviewed. At the end of your project, we all look better if you meet or even slightly exceed your projections.
And I think you touched on something there that's important in the review process, is be very clear of how you came to those numbers that you put down, and kind of explain your methodology for the reviewers so they have a better understanding of your scope of work and how it's going to get to those projected numbers. All right, so they have to, the performance measurements get tracked and reported over the lifetime of the grant. Do applicants and grantees, that's the word. Do grantees have to measure those like impact and performance measurements after the grant is over?
Well, ARC does not currently require any reporting after the final report is submitted and accepted. However, you may be contacted by an auditor and/or a researcher from ARC and asked for the most recent numbers and for documentation of those numbers. Under the terms of the grant agreement, you must provide the requested information and cooperate with the auditors and the researchers. Many projects we know do not realize their full outputs and outcomes until after the grant period is ended. If you're doing a training project, for example, and you're buying equipment, you've got to purchase the equipment, get it installed, get it online, and then you start enrolling trainees or students, and then it might be a year or two down the road before they finish and actually get a job. So with a workforce training project, you may make projections for up to 3 years beyond the closing of the grant. In that situation, we ask that you continue to track and document the outputs and outcomes and share that information with auditors and/or researchers if requested.
Okay, awesome. And this kind of gets back to something that Nancy Isle brought up, is making sure having all your ducks in a row, planning with the end in sight, especially make sure everything's organized and kept together, because auditing is very likely to happen down the line.
Definitely.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Jeff. And if you still have some lingering questions on the performance measurements, we have resources on the Power page that help define a good number of the performance measurements you may come across in the application portal. All right, so I'm going to change lanes here a little bit to touch on a particular project type, which is construction. So Power implementation projects can fund construction activities, but those have their own special requirements. And for this, I'm going to call on Molly Theobald, who is ARC's Director of our Critical Infrastructure Division. Molly?
Hello.
Hey, Molly. So if you're putting together a construction project via Power, you have to engage another agency to serve as the basic agency to help manage the grant. So for that, what's the appropriate timeline for procuring a basic agency in the Power application process? And what does that agreement need? When does that agreement need to be in place?
Sure. We get that question a lot. Securing a basic agency for your Power construction project can take several months. It really depends on the agency that you've asked to manage your project. Getting an agreement from a federal basic agency like HUD or Rural Development or EDA usually takes longer than working with a state basic agency. So if you are planning on using a federal agency, you should plan for 4 to 6 months to work through their review process. State agencies take a little less time, but they still need to assess your project idea. They need to determine if they're able to do the administration work, and they need to budget for it in their administrative expenses. So it really can't be a last minute arrangement. The key for any Power application that has a construction component is to meet with that agency as early as possible to get a sense if they are willing and able to manage your project. So you really should have preliminary discussions before you submit your application in the Power Portal, because you'll be asked about who will be managing your project, and it can't be a wish. It should be either a firm commitment or at the very minimum, a solid verbal pledge from that agency of their interest. Also, ARC has to have an arrangement in place with with whomever agency you are using before we can approve that project. Specifically, we need an MOU or a memo of understanding. So if you select an agency that has no pre-existing MOU with ARC, it's going to delay your project's review by ARC even longer. So you can connect with your state program managers to find out if that agency that you're considering has an MOU, or just send an email to the Power email address and we can get that information to you. In terms of what do you need at the time of application, you don't need the signed final commitment from that agency in order to complete the application, but you absolutely should be in negotiations. I would say a signed documentation from that agency has to be secured over the summer in order to get approved in this round of Power funding. You know, late August is the drop deadline.
Okay, awesome. So essentially, reach out sooner rather than later to make sure the basic agency that you want will be ready and willing by, I'd say, September 1st. And for that, also reach out to your state program managers because they're a great resource there. Awesome, thanks, Molly. So shifting to a construction-related project, I'm gonna bring up Mark DeFalco, who is our manager of our broadband program. So, Mark.
Hi, Braden, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, doing well. So broadband has been a priority for Power, and there is some nuance to kind of broadband deployment projects there. So what exactly is the distinction between a broadband deployment project, which has its own set of requirements and funding limits up to 2.5 million, and a broadband project that doesn't fall under that criteria and is more of a normal implementation project?
Yeah, wonderful question. And, you know, we have this broadband set aside funding, and we really want to make sure that it goes to broadband implementation projects. So, you know, consider the scenario where you have maybe an economic development agency or, you know, another economic group. And let's just say that they're going to, you know, try to create a workforce development center, which will be used to teach technology directly related to area companies, manufacturers, whatever. So in addition to creating the structure, the facility where they're going to be doing the teaching, the center is going to need a great deal of technology equipment, you know, video conferencing, whiteboards, lots of computers, software, routers, whatever. And then the agency is also going to need to have a provider run a fiber facility into the training center to give them the bandwidth they're going to need to be able to do their training. So if 65% of the total project costs involve the fiber deployment, then we would consider this a broadband deployment project. However, if the technology equipment component is going to exceed 35% of the total costs, then even though this is a broadband project, it would not be considered a broadband deployment project and then would not fall into the special broadband deployment funding. So this rule is just a way to make sure that if you're going to go for broadband deployment, for the special funding for broadband deployment, that we're making sure that, you know, 65% of the project or greater is related to the broadband deployment. Other broadband related projects that would not be classified as broadband deployment would include providing technology related to technical assistance to area businesses and projects that help increase broadband utilization and adoption, because they're not deployment. They're just other projects that are very much broadband related, but not broadband deployment.
Awesome. So for those interested in broadband and they're trying to understand which camp they fall under, broadband deployment, which is up to 2.5 million, and other broadband considerations, which is up to 1.5 million, like implementation. They should look in their budget and determine how much of that is going towards fiber deployment. And there's a 65% threshold there.
Right. And if there's any questions, feel free to contact us and we'll help step you through it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. Awesome. So that kind of runs through our kind of like the frequently asked questions that we've received and gathered. And as Mark said, if you do have specific questions about your project, that project type, please drop a line at power@arc.gov. So we'll take that and we'll make sure that the best person at ARC can answer that for you to make sure you're ready to go when you're ready to submit your application. So from what I understand and have been told, that most all of the Q&As that have been dropped in the Q&A box have been answered by staff. But I'm going to give it, we have a little bit of time. I'm going to give it another like 45 seconds. If you have any questions at that time, drop it in that Q&A box and we'll see if we can get that answered for you. So take a little breather and we'll be right back in less than a minute. All right, so I'll answer one question, and this is about the page limit in the application. So for implementation projects, there is a 100-page limit for what you can submit, and this includes your written narrative and all your attachments. And the question is there a shorter page limit for the narrative portion? And there is. So we have a limit of 15 typed pages for your written responses to all the questions in the application portal. So you have those 15 pages, then you have 85 there for all your accompanying documents. Okay. I'm going to call up Molly Theobald for a construction related question. Molly?
Yes, here I am.
Awesome. So one question we got is, what are the parameters around who applies for the grant and who owns and oversees the property for a construction related grant? Hopefully that's clear.
So the property has to be under public control. So county owned, nonprofit owned, state owned. What it can't be is privately owned. We can, so that's sort of the rule. We don't want to put improvements on privately owned property. You know, there's right-of-way arrangements, lease arrangements, so we can provide a little more information if you send your specific issue to the Power email address and get specific information to you. But overall, whatever improvement we're making, we want to make it in the public venue.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and what Molly said about sending your question into the power@arc.gov email address, because we're going to have 200-ish applications and they're all going to have their different quirks. So if you have any questions, please drop it there and we'll make sure to get it answered as best as we can as soon as possible. All right, we'll take 2 more questions. And first one is Nancy Isle, call you up on an eligibility question.
Yes. Hello, Braden.
Hey, Nancy. So we had a question. Is a 501c6 an eligible entity to be a lead applicant?
Yeah, absolutely. I did answer that in the chat, but we don't get into the weeds on whether certain types of nonprofit entities as organized under the IRS code whether they're eligible or not. Basically, the only entities that are not eligible or able to submit applications are for-profit entities. But if you're a nonprofit, you can apply.
Okay, awesome. And that answers another question we had about, can a for-profit internet service provider apply? And that kind of answers the question there. It's like, no. Yep. So for-profits are generally they can't be lead applicants on a power proposal, but they can be helpful partners, but they can't be lead applicants. All right. And let's see. Sorry, y'all, reading all the questions. And I see people are answering them live as well. All right. And all right, so the last one I'll answer live here is when you're applying, will you be assigned a person at ARC as the go-to project manager? And when does that happen? So the project manager at ARC is the one that helps kind of manage your grant, and they're there to bounce any questions off if you are selected to be approved. So at this time, no. Power is a competitive process. So we try not to get too involved internally with the proposals. The assignment for a project coordinator at ARC happens later on in the review process after they've gone through the review scoring as well. So once we find the projects that are selected to move forward, that is when you will be assigned an ARC project coordinator that you can start working with to start fleshing out and fine tuning your proposal. All right, so at this time, a few more questions that are being answered here, but we'll make sure to get to you. And if you have any questions that come up later, please drop a line at power@arc.gov. We'll be monitoring that inbox pretty intently, making sure all your questions get answered before that March 5th deadline for the LOI, and as well as the April 16th deadline for the full application. And there are the important application dates to remember. So March 5th, LOIs are due. And this is a mistype. Please email them to power@arc.gov. We'll fix that before we send out the PowerPoints. And full applications are due April 16th. And both of these carry a 5 p.m. Eastern deadline time. So please remember that. And again, just more information about the Power Application Portal. So you'll get access to this once your LOI is sent in and approved. So again, organize your contacts, get all your administrative info ready. The narrative questions will track with the RFP. So look in the RFP below the review rubric. Those are the questions we're going to ask. So once you send in your LOI, you don't have to wait on us to start organizing your application. Those are the questions. You can start filling in and organizing your responses there. And then once you get access to the application, you can start plugging it in. Answer every question, please answer them. This will definitely help the reviewers better understand your project and have them spend less time hunting down any answers or context in your attachments. With that, you have 100 pages to make your case, and 15 of those are your written response narrative. And again, everything is due on April 16th. All right, and with that, thank you all for joining in today. We will kind of put together a frequently asked questions document from everything we've talked about today, and we'll upload that to our website, arc.gov/power. We also recorded this video, and we'll tag the different questions in the bio. So if you have a specific question that you remember and you want to come back to the answer, we'll make sure it's very quick and easy that you can find that in this 40-minute video. And again, thanks for your time. Remember the deadlines, especially the March 5th LOI. And with that, I will also say reach out to your state program managers sooner rather than later. They're great resources and you need to reach out to them, make sure everything's in order. And with that, thank you all for joining in today, and I hope you have a good rest of your Thursday. Take care.